There we go. I
Well,
can maybe take this one.
yeah, why don't you take this one, Cam?
Sure, I won't go through this all again, everyone. This is just my contact info. I did the intro at the top. Again, Cam Conrad. There's all my contact info if you'd like to connect or get in touch.
Groovy. So we've got our obligatory house rules slide. We're trying to make sure that our mugs stay user-focused and a safe space. So please don't promote or pitch your firm or your consultancy. Please don't contact people outside of the group without their consent. And if you share a use case, please don't share that outside of the group unless you've checked in with the person on the front end. If you want to stay connected, we have Bevy is the new tool. Honestly, I think the easiest way to get to this is to just go through your Marketo instance via community. If you look for events, you'll find our most recent event, and that's an easy way to connect with the group. But once you find it's listed as the Minneapolis user group right now. I'm working on changing that. But just click to join the chapter. It's a lot easier to communicate with everybody if you're in here because we have a system that it just sends out automated emails for us. So it's a great way to get a hold of everyone. All right, if you want to be part of the Purple Select program, you can sign up at marketo.influitive.com. I don't know if anybody here has participated in that. I know I signed up at one point, but I haven't really done much with it.
I've done it a few years ago at a previous stop and got a couple cool little swaggy things out of it. It's a good thing to do on a Friday afternoon if you want to get to the weekend.
There you go. Okay. So there are some upcoming events for MUG members. Summit, I guess, is in the works again for April of next year. Doesn't look if they're commenting on whether it'll be in person or not at this point. Probably, I would guess probably virtual again.
It is virtual.
Is it? Okay. And then there are a few MUG meetings left yet this month. There's the manufacturing MUG tomorrow that Michael runs, I believe. And then there's a North America virtual one as well, I think later today. Then we want to make sure everybody is aware. We have our event for November scheduled already. Drift is going to come and talk about database maintenance. I just slacked in the chat the link to the actual event if you'd like to sign up now so you don't forget. But we're looking forward to a pretty good meeting. And Drift is also sponsoring the event, and they will be giving access to people who attend to their they have a learning community. So that'll be kind of a nice benefit of attending.
And then I can talk about this one. So the meeting we are in right now is actually sponsored by Mops Pros, which is an online, actually a free Slack community for all things marketing operations. So it's something I'm a member of. There's a specific Minneapolis-St. Paul channel in there. It's just a great place to go if you have any issues or questions or you're running up against something. It's a place full of super smart people, lots of champions and ex-champions in there, people that are really willing to help you think through your problems. It contains specific channels from everything from marketing operations memes to career advice to MarTech stack kind of discussions, really fun stuff and super technical, super helpful stuff. I've really enjoyed going on there. I know I've seen a lot of value just kind of getting an answer to a difficult question. There's tons of people on there, and it's certainly somebody who's seen the issue that you're working through. Totally free to join, kind of like the mug, the same type of spirit where there's promotions not allowed. It's really supposed to be kind of like a sharing of ideas type place. So we'll send out the deck, but that link there to join, or you can simply Google Mops Pros, will get you in. And I think you'll really like it. And there's a lot of value there. And then for the sponsorship today, Mops Pros is going to send out cool little Mops Pro stickers to anyone who wants one. So if you're on the call and you're interested, and you just want to throw your email address, I guess, in the chat, I can grab those and follow up with you and get that sent out to you. And then I forgot to add in the slide here, Katie. Do we want to pause before we get into Lydia's presentation, just talk about like any open opportunities or job recs or that kind of thing?
Yeah, I was just thinking that since we have a little bit of time before 9. Sorry, guys, we're all still learning how to do these things virtually. It's hard to get all the timing exactly on the money, but I do know there's at least a few open roles out there that people want to talk about. So, does anybody have anything?
I actually have a couple I can rattle off real quick.
Okay.
So the two most, we actually have 3 right now. We're growing pretty quick. We have a technical product manager, which would be more like on the dev kind of custom solution building side. A senior marketing intelligence analyst, so somebody, again, more on the analytics side of the world, and then a campaign operations manager. All 3 of those are posted. Let me know if you are interested in those or know somebody who is. I can get you in touch with the right person.
Ruby, anybody else have any open roles they'd like to talk about?
I know at Perforce Software, we're looking for a new ops specialist to join our team. Hoping to find someone with maybe 3 to 5 years experience at least, someone a little more senior that can join our team as we are also growing and we have sort of a complex network of 4 Marketo instances. So yeah, that job just posted. So we'll be looking for someone to join Katie and I and our one other team member, Lindsay. Katie, I can grab the link to the posting, or if you have access to it, you can grab it as well for later. I don't know if that's how we want to do it, or you guys can just reach out to me as well if you have interest.
Yeah, if you don't mind throwing the link into the chat, that would be awesome, Scott.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. So I think we're at a moment here. And we've lost a few people. That's no good. I don't know. What do you think? Shall we dive in, or do you think we're too ahead of the game?
I think we can go for it.
All right. Well, why don't you flip the slide?
I guess that's my job, isn't it? Okay, here we go.
Okay, so I'm delighted to introduce, if you can roll one more, Lydia Habte to speak with us about understanding the customer journey with Marketo and Google Analytics. She and I have worked together in the past, and I've just been tremendously impressed with her work. I will let her talk about herself now a little bit, and we'll just launch right in. Thank you so much.
Having me. I'm excited to be able to speak with everybody today. Just want to start out with a little bit about myself. I have been around the world and back again, I feel like. I've worked in-house. I've worked on the agency side. I'm currently working on at a consulting firm. I've done freelance. Industry-wise, I've been across the board as well. Higher education, e-commerce, B2B, nonprofit, B2C as well. Only one I haven't done is manufacturing, so that would be interesting. And my experience has been a broad range of things, including the marketing measurement strategy development, implementing different tracking systems, figuring out how different marketing technologies need to communicate in order to achieve business goals, database analysis, sales funnel analysis, coaching people on data governance, figuring out what are the right dashboards, reporting, as well as looking at org structures and helping companies understand how they can get the most out of their current org, or if they need to look at hiring more people onto their team. So if we want to. So today I have a short amount of slides. Really, I wanted to make sure that this felt more engaging. if there's any questions, I could be able to answer those. Also, I just want to make it very clear, this isn't a how-to guide. There's a lot of pieces that are going to be discussed that have a lot of in-depth components. And so if after this presentation anyone has questions, I'll make sure Katie has my contact information. I'm always happy to give any advice that I can, or answer any questions that people have. So let's get started. So why do I do what I do, and why are we talking about connecting Marketo with Google Analytics? Well, one of the things that marketing organizations are starting to understand more and more is, in order to meet their business objectives, they need to have integrated tracking capabilities. It's no longer okay for systems to be siloed. Each system has its own separate pieces of information that, when connected, you really start to get a holistic picture of your customer as well as your investment. So you start to understand objectively, how is your marketing really performing, understand your ROI, your ROAS, really start to figure out what's the right media mix, and identify areas of opportunity in the future. And so there's many tracking and measurement tools. These are just a few. You have your site behavior tools, sales funnel tools, search engine analytical tools, A/B testing and experience management tools. Today, the focus is going to be on that site behavior tools, which is the Google Analytics piece, as well as how that can play well with Marketo. So typically, a customer journey is really not a linear journey, right? We've learned over time in marketing that typically customer journeys have anywhere between 3 touch points to 30 touch points. It really depends on your business model, the time it takes for decision making, and as such, you really don't want to use outdated methodologies like a last touch attribution model to say this is the thing that drove my business, right? Like, for instance, in this example, we're talking about opportunity close one, but as you can see, this customer has been touched by a paid ad. They've organically searched for the company. They've had multiple paid ads after. Again, they've engaged with your email content, and that last touch point was paid. In that traditional model, the only piece that's ever equated as being part of the success would be that paid ad, which would be inappropriate considering how much money you spent to actually get them to that opportunity close one. Along the way, you also see that there are milestones that are being hit by each one of these touch points that would not be viewed in a last touch model. And so typically, what you want to start thinking about is, how can I augment data within my system to help me understand those different touch points, as well as what milestones were hit along that journey. While thinking about it, you want to start thinking about, what information can I augment my Google Analytics data with that's not personally identifiable, but that is helpful for being able to slice my data appropriately. So examples would be the title of a lead record. So that way you could take a look at your overall data set in Google Analytics and start to understand, like, how do my directors utilize my content? How are they coming to the website versus, my, senior analysts? The same goes with accounts. Account names are appropriate to send to Google Analytics because, again, not PII, so long as you're not sending email addresses, first name, last name, etc. You also can send each of these milestones to Google Analytics. Reason you would want to do that is these are not actually on the front end. So you are not able to see when someone goes MQL, for instance, on the front end of your site. And so you would want to augment that data once that instance happens, sending that to Google Analytics to be analyzed. So as I mentioned earlier, there's multiple steps you have to take in order to get Marketo data to Google Analytics. That First component is the Google Analytics client ID. This is essentially your primary key between, your primary key into Google Analytics. And so that has to be collected in Marketo in order for you to set up the calls that need to be set up to send the data from Marketo to Google Analytics and get on the Google Analytics side, identify the right record to send the data to. Next, before you begin on this journey, you want to identify what important pieces of information are you trying to send to Google Analytics. This is key. This is the place I tell all clients, companies to spend the most time on, is creating a list of what am I trying to be able to understand within my Google Analytics. How do I want to slice that data? What information about my customer is relevant, as well as what events do I want to send. So going back to that example, do I want to send when someone goes MQL? Do I want to send an event that identifies that this is that moment in time that that lead was created in the system? All of that information, you want to essentially create a map of that and make sure that you can identify what triggers that all those different touch points and events. Next, you want to create custom dimensions and goals in Google Analytics. The custom dimensions piece is going to be the attributes that you've identified of your lead record that you want to send over. You'll create custom dimensions to essentially accept that information. Goals is more so if you start identifying events such as when they MQL, when they SQL, when an opportunity is created, those can be sent as events and then set up as goals in Google Analytics. And so you can then increment those goals and start to see, okay, what are the different touch points that got me to that point, that event that I'm deeming important. Next, you want to create Google Analytics webhooks in Marketo. So this piece is a little more involved. At the end of this presentation, I do have links that explain these in detail and helpful ways to get those set up. Essentially, based on your step 2, you will have to identify the different, you'll have to identify how many webhooks you need to create that corresponds with the data that you're saying you want to send. The one thing you never want to do is create a webhook that sends an empty value. The reason for that is, for instance, custom dimensions, you have the ability to make them user-based, which means it's that lead records attribute. If you set it once and then send an empty value, it will actually replace that value with empty. So you want to be very careful that you're orchestrating it in a way that says, all right, these are the webhooks that I'll send at this point of time because those values are for sure going to exist. So you really do have to map out your strategy in step 2 very well, because step 4 will be very reliant on that. Step 5, you want to create campaigns to appropriately call the Google Analytics webhooks, as I mentioned. And so within step 5, you could technically call multiple webhooks. So if you have a webhook that only sends, for instance, when an opportunity goes close won, but your campaign has other details that you also want to send along that describe the lead record. So maybe it's the title or the account name, etc. You could have one smart campaign that calls the 2 webhooks that would then augment the data appropriately. And lastly, step 6, you want to add your Google Analytics client ID to the Marketo forms as a hidden field. And so this can be done one or two ways, and I've seen it done one or two ways. So organizations that have a lot of different forms tend to want to basically send the data on the front end so that they don't have to go in each form and add the hidden field, as that's really time consuming. Usually that step though is done by a developer or somebody that understands your basic front end code. Otherwise, if you would like to go in individually, you can then add that field as a hidden field, and you just need to make sure that you're capturing that information on the front end to send to that hidden field. If we move on. Okay. So essentially, you've done all this work. Then what? What do you do with it? So there's many out-of-the-box tools that Google Analytics has. One of the ones that I tend to use the most, and I tend to steer my clients towards using the most, is your model comparison tool. And you're using advanced segments on any one of the reports that exist. So the model comparison tool, what that's doing is it's looking at the different touch points within your customer journey from a marketing standpoint. So this isn't going to be, for instance, content. It will not be looking at what content did they look at. This is looking at what engagement was there. So was it paid search? Was it organic? Was it email? This is also very important thing to note is emails, making sure that you're tagging them appropriately so that you can see them. And so adding UTMs on links that send your users to your website is really important, because then it can be part of the analysis to see how much of the opportunity closed won, for instance, if that's the goal we're analyzing, how much of your emails actually move the needle toward that opportunity going close one. And so in the model comparison tool, you have different attribution models that you can choose from. In this example, I chose linear. So essentially every touch point gets the same amount of credit, and it divides it across all the different touch points to tell you of that one opportunity close one, how much of it was due to paid search versus email versus organic. The next one is segments. And so applying segments on your Google Analytics reports is huge. And I feel like it's usually underutilized. So for instance, we talked about sending different attributes of your customer, like title or account name. You could then augment your reports by bringing that in. So in this example, I have this report isolated to one specific account that I had cared about. And I wanted to know within that account, what were the top performing pages, pieces of content. I have it actually isolated to the blog pieces of content, and seeing what are the different titles of people within that account that have been looking at different blog content. I can then even further analyze this and say, well, I really only care of, in this example, the director of analytics and the marketing analytics manager. That's the only two titles that I think are relevant, and I want to understand what are they most engaging with. So you can fine tune that and really start to understand that those types of customers and see what's working and what's not within a specific account, within a specific type of title. So that being said, as I mentioned, a lot of this is very, what's the word I'm looking for? It's very involved. It looks great when you look at it as steps, but each step really you have to think through it. So if we go on to the next slide, the best resources that I've used in my career and that my colleagues have used are here. And so Google Analytics Hit Builder is going to be what helps you design the necessary, what they call payload for your Marketo webhooks that you're going to create. And so here, once you've identified the types of data that you want to send, this resource will actually allow you to build out how that call needs to be structured in order to send that data over to Google Analytics from Marketo. The next resource, the Marketo webhook, that offers a very detailed step-by-step guide of what is the webhook, how do you create it, and then that term payload makes a lot of sense once you've actually went through that step-by-step guide. The next one is custom dimensions and metrics. This is really useful because in Google Analytics, when you're trying to configure a dimension or a metric, there are different types of scopes that you can select from. And so this helps you identify what is the right scope that I should configure my fields for. And so again, in that step 2, once you've figured out what kind of data you're going to send, this custom dimensions and metrics will actually help you identify how you want to set that up within Google Analytics to receive the data. Getting client ID from the cookie. And so I mentioned that front end piece of needing to get the client ID into one of your hidden fields, whether the hidden field is on the form itself, or if your developer is going to do it on the front end. This is the code snippet that's used to actually get the client ID from your browser or from your customer's browsers. It's really simple. It's a copy and paste, and you'll be good to go. Google Analytics for beginners, I send anyone to this resource that is not comfortable with Google Analytics. It shows everything from understanding what reports exist down to what capabilities you can add to each report. It also talks about campaign conversion tracking. And so, as I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that your emails are tagged appropriately. This is a really good resource for understanding what UTM parameters you should be adding at the bare minimum and how that would be processed. I went through that fairly quickly so that I could get to questions because I'd rather have this be more of an engaging presentation. So, are there any questions?
I have one, Lydia.
Yeah.
This is Cam. Are there any, like, what would you say the common, or like, what would the prerequisites be, at least on like the GA side, things that people are generally gonna want to be comfortable or doing before they get to this, which seems to me like to be a more advanced function.
Yeah, definitely. So I always say that you want to be comfortable at the bare minimum understanding event tracking, right? Understanding how traffic comes to your site, pulling those types of reports, because a lot of this advanced augmentation of the data really only helps if you're doing that bare minimum in Google Analytics. Also, I always advise that if you don't have a dashboard yet, this is probably overkill, right? Because if you don't have a dashboard, essentially you're likely not looking at the data enough to understand what's good, like what's your benchmarks, and then having that augmented data kind of it tends to make it a little more confusing if you don't fully understand how your baseline was before you started augmenting. And so that's usually what I tell people is, first of all, get set up with your basic reports, make sure you feel comfortable understanding event tracking, because again, those metrics that are there are a little different than your basic like sessions, et cetera.
Sure.
And then the other piece too is that really understanding how data flowing to Google Analytics works. So one of the gotchas, right, that I will call out is anytime you send data to Google Analytics that does not have a source associated with it. So essentially saying what the source and the medium is, it will show up as direct traffic. As the last touch. Now, where that's different is for conversions, right? So if you look at your basic goal completions, if there was anything that was not direct prior to that completion, it will give credit to that versus direct. So there's a save there, but it's also just understanding those little nuances, because then you understand how to analyze the data that's coming in.
Got it. So in that last example, like let's say there's 5 touch points before the conversion. The 5th one comes in with no UTM parameters. Rather than showing that as direct, it's going to just revert back to where you actually had some data.
Correct. Yep.
Got it.
And the only other non-UTM parameters that it will revert to is referral traffic and organic traffic.
Got it.
Because they don't need UTMs. There's a whole algorithm that's happening for that.
Sure.
Good question. Any other questions?
I'm curious, how does this sort of analytics play with the whole with GDPR, in the sense of, I mean, I assume that it looks like the data that we're seeing on the Google Analytics side is still anonymized, or how
Correct.
are we?
Correct.
How does that work out?
Yeah, it is still anonymized. So that is why I always emphasize that do not send PII to Google Analytics. So there's Google Analytics themselves will do random audits on accounts, and if they see PII in an account, you essentially run the risk of being shut down. And so there's that piece. You definitely do not want to send email addresses, first name, last name, Anything that essentially can be combined to get to this is the person I'm looking at, you want to avoid, right? But when you think about like an account name, that's general enough that you can get away with that, right? The other piece is, and I've done this in the past, when people say that they do want to get to that, like that specific lead record. So if you want to get to that level of reporting, what I always suggest is sending the Marketo ID as your key back into Marketo as a custom dimension into Google Analytics. And then what that allows you to do is you can then pull all the data that you're collecting within Google Analytics, as well as the data in Marketo, and use an outside data visualization tool to get an understanding at a person level, if that's the detail that you're looking for. But you definitely don't want to have that done in Google Analytics itself.
I've never had the opportunity to work in a paid instance of Google Analytics. Do they allow that on the paid end, or no? It's just
No, it's just, yeah, it's the same rules. Google Analytics wants everything to be anonymized. And this is one of the things that your Google reps will even suggest is if you're trying to get to a known, to a lead level of data, you're going to want to send that to a database. And so that's when they'll start pushing things like BigQuery. It's basically you can get all the data that's being collected in Google Analytics pushed into BigQuery, which is their database. And if you're sending that Marketo ID along with all of this other information that you're augmenting, you can then use that, connect that data from Marketo and create your queries within BigQuery to get reporting done at a person level. The paid version of Google Analytics, the biggest benefit is the amount of data that can be collected before you go to sampling, and the amount of custom dimensions that you can actually create. So there's limitations on the free version of how many you can have. It's a much higher limit for the paid version. But to be honest, I always advise companies, organizations, if you're not utilizing the free version to its maximum potential, you probably shouldn't be on the paid version of Google Analytics. It's a lot of money to invest.
If no one else has an immediate question, I have one last one, if that's okay. Okay. Lydia, so talking about pushing data to other databases, could you just give us just a brief overview of some of the different platforms that you have used for like data warehouses, and like how you would rank them in terms of their friendliness to this sort of data?
So usually I'm not on the database side of things in the sense of instantiating it. Usually each client has their own, and I work within whatever system they've chosen to house their data. But I've seen it done in BigQuery, and I've worked within that. So it really does depend. So let me back up. It really does depend on the stack, your technology stack. So if you're a heavy Google-based stack, I think BigQuery is a great. BigQuery is a great use case for you, right? Reason for it is a lot of the different Google products, you're able to send that data to BigQuery relatively easily. It's integrated relatively easily. And so I would say like that's not a bad idea. Now you have AWS, you have SQL databases. Like every database pretty much has its flaws in the sense of, do you have the manpower to maintain it? And so one of the big things is it's not necessarily the database, it's the personnel. Do you have people who can build the connectors that you need to to basically port over the data from the different data sources you're looking for? And then if you are manually creating these connections, so say you're not using some sort of ETLing tool to do this for you, do you have the manpower to maintain the connectors to these different sources? And so I'm a big proponent of instead of creating your own connectors, finding tools that can sit in the middle and do a lot of that ETL work for you, because those companies, they have dedicated software engineers that are working on making sure they're up to date on API changes, And if there's any bugs within the code, they're working to modify that and correct it. Whereas when you have like a team of 2 engineers that are dedicated to your entire company, the likelihood of them being solely focused on your marketing sources is a lot smaller. So you wind up with data that may not be accurate, and a lot of times it goes unseen until you've used it for a year or two, and then you start to realize that there's something wrong. And so it's not necessarily, like I said, it's not necessarily a database. It's more how are you going to set it up and maintain it, and are you willing to invest in the tools to get that done, or the dedicated staff for it.
Can I
Great.
ask you a question?
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lydia.
Yeah, no problem.
So I learned a lot from this. I thank you for presenting it. I'd like to ask you a little bit about the way that you're architecting your webhook calls from Marketo, and kind of how those are structured out. Are you basically placing kind of a webhook flow step right before your success program status change then basically in each of your programs, or do you have it kind of centralized? And how do you prevent like a situation where maybe a token is required for your payload that maybe isn't collected by the form, or some of those anomalies that kind of crop up?
Yeah, I love that question. Okay, so for each scenario, I do things differently. One, all my webhooks I keep in an operational program, and so I advise against going program for program and creating your webhook there. I think it's centralizing is the right way to go. So one, in my smart list, I make sure if the payloads that I'm trying to send, for instance, is title, company, not phone number, that's an awful idea. Title, company, I think what else? Status, right? Lead status. What I do is for each one of them, I say like, is the field, basically the field cannot be empty. Right. So if I know that those 3 should always be not empty at the same time, I'll keep them grouped together, and I'll add that extra step of saying cannot be empty. And the same goes in the webhook call. So if I want to create like a webhook call that's for each specific thing, I can. But if you know that like all your forms are going to ask for title and company and it's a required field, there's absolutely no reason to create a separate webhook and a separate smart list for them, right? But as an added, just to make sure, in that flow step, I basically will create a choice, and I will say, it can, if it's not empty, then call webhook, otherwise do nothing. And the reason for that is to your point, Michael, like how do I ensure that no empty values are being set and basically overwriting information that I already have? So that's good, right? Like, but again, it goes back to that step 2 that I was talking about, really mapping what are you trying to send and when is it available. That's why that piece probably takes the longest out of everything. When I'm setting the things up like this for a client, that is the thing that takes the longest, is me trying to fully understand, when does this data get collected? What am I trying to send? Are there any gotchas, right? A lot of times when I set things up too, I'll create a testing account in Google Analytics where I just only send the data there just so I can see it coming through. So if I do start seeing those random patterns, I can catch it then before I start augmenting the actual account itself. And there are cool tricks there so that you don't feel like you're having to start over when you do try to send it over then to the real account, and we can always talk about that as well. But the other piece that's really important is fully understand like what webhooks are you trying to send, in the sense of, are they events or are they going to be custom dimensions? So that's another piece that you just got to make sure you're clear on. And then the client ID, the one thing that I don't think you'll probably find in a lot of the resources is client ID can be overwritten. And the reason you want to be okay with overwriting the client ID is, say somebody clears their cookies, a new client ID will be generated for that browser. And so you want to make sure that you're augmenting then that piece as well when that new client ID gets generated. And And then there's other things about sending Marketo ID along with it that makes it helpful, right? Because the lead record will always have the same Marketo ID so long as there's not like a duplicate. So yeah. And Michael, if you have additional questions, because it may be something that you want to set up in the future, I'm more than happy to be a resource for you to just ping questions off of.
Yeah, I might take you up on that. How do I get to the links in your resource slide there? Those look really good.
Yeah, Katie, are you sending this deck out to everybody?
Yes, we will be posting it on the event page, and I'm not certain if it automatically sends a follow-up or not. Cam and I will look into that.
Be a follow-up email. I'm not sure if the recording, well, the recording won't be clickable, right? But I'm not sure if the slide deck do that. But it'd be great to get those from you. I'd really like to read them. It looks really good.
Yeah. And I realized I didn't put any contact information, but I'm more than happy to add that too. Sorry.
Lydia, if you are comfortable with it, we could post these on our LinkedIn group.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
I also have a question. Hi, Lydia. This is Scott. So do you ever run into problems with data cleanliness, especially in terms of like the account? So, say an opportunity closed won on a company like Ford or something, and you have different names in your database, like different Ford company names. So you have Ford and you have Ford Motor Co. and you have Ford Motor. How do you deal with instances like that where, a lot of the fields you're talking about are free text fields, right? Where you can put in your own company name. And so I don't know if you recommend like one of those form complete texts that like can help someone like make sure that data as it's coming in is as clean as it possibly is, or how you deal with that on your end.
Yeah, so the form complete text rate only works if it's a Marketo landing page, or if you have a developer that's going to ping back the database to pull back the information. It's interesting. I've seen this no matter how much companies try to mitigate it. So one of the things is either you as a company are looking at your data and consistently cleaning it on a certain cadence. Or B, you're only allowing certain types of values to be inputted, right? The biggest one that I normally see it with, to be honest, is titles. Titles are usually the biggest issue that I've seen. Companies, not so much, because once the CRM data basically comes back into Marketo, whatever the company is within the CRM is going to be your source of truth. Because that's how the sales team is going to operate, and that's technically how you want to bring that data back to augment. But titles is a big one, and so I've seen it where companies will only give a finite list for a user to choose from. So and I'm sure all of you have seen it where if you're an analyst, you're an analyst. You don't get the option to be a marketing analyst, a senior analyst, a director, none of that, right? Like you're just that. And I think a lot of that is to mitigate that data cleanliness issue. Otherwise, the other piece is having some sort of a rolling list, essentially, of known values that are your constant perpetrators, and having that be like a lookup table that then you use to augment the data. So if it's this, then send this instead.
Cool.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I guess my other one is as far as time from startup to implementation, like if you have, say you have a company that has sort of all the right pieces in place, you have marketing ops people that are talented and can build webhooks, and you have Google Analytics people, do you have sort of a standard ETA for what it takes to sort of get up and running from the beginning of the process to where you're actually getting good data and putting it into usable reports and metrics and that?
Yeah, so this is just my standard response to that, right? If everything works well, everything's perfect, it's a month. And the reason I say it's a month is the actual process of creating these things isn't what takes long. It's the process of mapping what is it you're trying to send, getting alignment on that. It's the process of then sending it somewhere where you can test the data to make sure it's coming through appropriately. So I had mentioned earlier, I usually send information to a testing account. I monitor that account for 2 weeks. And so I usually tell people if I need 2 weeks to monitor the data, basically tack that on to how quickly we need to run. So if you want to stay within that month, basically the webhooks, the updating of forms, the mapping of what it is we're going to collect needs to be done in 2 weeks. It's possible. I've done it. I've done this with different organizations, but it's everyone has to be aligned and willing to spend the time to do it.
Sure. And do you find when you're helping people do this that it's hard to shift them out of looking at closed won information out of like Salesforce or your CRM, for instance, and trying to add Google Analytics as sort of an element of where we evaluate sort of our multi-touch or like how like campaign effectiveness and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's usually not hard to get marketing organizations to do it. It's usually more difficult to get the sales team to believe it. Because marketers know that they're spending so much time and effort into all of these different touch points that they know aided to getting to an opportunity to close one, but it's never seen on the Salesforce side, for instance, because you're usually just collecting that one touch point. And so usually the marketers don't have much resistance to start looking at that multi-touch model, but usually it's getting that buy-in from the sales team to believe that these are all the things that we did to help you get this lead that then went to close one. And so it really does depend like how your organization is structured. Is it structured in a way where your sales team understands that there are multiple things that you're doing, or is it in a way that you still need to get buy-in from them in order to shift that mentality and shift reporting? I have also seen it done where the data is brought into the database where all the reporting is done. So that way it's all in one place. And so you're not asking users to go to like Google Analytics, for instance, to see that information.
Well, can you provide an example? Like what kind of platforms have you seen the data being brought into?
So usually it'll be brought into like a visualization tool, like for instance, Tableau. So
Okay.
you essentially can send, depending on how much data you're trying to pull out of Google Analytics, you can connect directly into it and use like a primary key, like I had explained, like Marketo ID can be used as one where it connects to the information that exists on your Marketo side or your Salesforce side. And that'll be your connector to the Google Analytics side of the data. And then you can visualize it and create all of your reporting in like a Tableau or a Power BI. Or I've also seen it where the data is ported into the data warehouse where your reporting lives. And so if you're using some sort of other visualization tool that doesn't have like a direct connector, that's usually a nice way of getting your data in a place where that visualization tool can get the data in one centralized location.
Awesome. That's excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Lydia, can I just piggyback off that? At that point, now it's when you're able to like associate a specific record's information. So like now the PII concerns are no longer
Are
there.
negligible.
Like, yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Cool.
Exactly. Yeah. And then and that's if you get to that point, I'm assuming your teams have already done the security diligence to make
Yes.
sure that yep, exactly. Yep.
I have maybe one more that's a little broader, not as GA specific, but you mentioned a couple different attribution kind of concepts going through your presentation. First of all, how last touch really isn't a very good indicator of kind of the whole story. And then you showed an example, I think, of just kind of the linear where you're weighting every touch point the same. So obviously this kind of varies by organization and industry, but I'm curious, are there any other kind of models? I know there's like W models and certain attribution models. Are there any one that you're partial to or you've seen work well as far as like weighting different touch points?
Yeah. So I've seen, for instance, time decay ones that work well, and the organizations that I've seen decide on that model are usually ones that have a really long sales cycle, right? Anywhere from a year or more. And so trying to give the first touch point the same amount of credit as the last touch point isn't really a fair attribution model, because there's basically touch points that kept them engaged, and that's really what got them to that closed one. Um, and so again, that is up to the business if that's how they want to look at it. Another way is you can actually create your own model. And so, for instance, if you say, the first touch point that got them to be known to us is really important, we want to weigh that heavily. And then we want to also weigh equal touch points essentially to anything that happened, after a certain amount of time or within a certain amount of time of that closed one. You can actually create those types of models as well. And so it really does depend on, one, do you have an analyst, right, that can help you create this, analyze this data, or two, are you trying to use attribution models that you don't have to maintain that already exist? If so, which one really fits your business model? Again, like if you have a very long sales cycle, that time decay probably makes more sense for you. So yeah, if that answers your question.
Yeah, totally. Thank you.
If you have had much experience kind of moving period costs from Marketo through this method, basically, I know you can reference it directly right off of the period cost section of Marketo, but maybe through like a local token, and could you talk a little bit about whether that's been used, whether you've used that in the past, and if there's any tips around that?
That is one I have not done. Yeah, that is one I have not done. I've done it. It's interesting. I've done uploading cost from different marketing sources, except for Marketo. And so I would say if it's something that you can't get as a token, you would have to figure out a customized field essentially where you're inputting that information somehow. The only problem with that is it's going to be like a one-time field, right? And so you would have to figure out a way that maybe it would be like something to the effect of engagement and sending that information along, or I'm sure we could hack it. It's just that I know with tokens, it probably wouldn't work. Like we'd have to come up with a good flow that essentially sends that data one time, just so that we have it for that specific campaign. And so it would be a matter of actually architecting it and mapping out like what that flow would look like and ensuring it only happened once for each record. Okay. I'm sure we can come up with something, Michael. Let's offline that.
Yeah, it's just interesting to see. You have the cost data in one spot, right?
And so the other way to also do it is if you can export the cost data into like a Google Sheet of some sort, you could theoretically then upload that cost data using a script within G Sheet, for instance, to then automatically do it every time you upload it. So like if the cadence is when you create these programs, you're going to upload cost at that same time, and just having that part of the flow. It's just a matter of automating it and how well we could automate it.
Okay, interesting. Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? And actually, along with that breath too, UTMs, I had mentioned adding those into your campaigns. One of the things I've seen done as well is, so, your UTM source, for instance, if you wanted it to be the name of your channel type, so if it's a nurture program, etc., creating that token and then just identifying that token inside of your asset, like your email asset. That's one way to do it, so you're not manually having to type it in. And then the campaign name could then get pulled in. But the one thing I always advise is if you're going to token and like use whatever exists within your programs or your campaigns, you just want to make sure you're not naming it anything that you don't want your larger audience to know. Because again, it's going to show up in the browser when they click on the link. So just a bit of advice there. Yeah. Question?
Maybe one other one, I guess, is, just to talk a little bit about the coding on that hidden form field for gathering the client ID then, and in terms of, so you're grabbing that basically off of you have the scripting inside of your one of the links and the resources that you're talking about that you should have put into your website when you're embedding the form, or is that actually in the Marketo form builder, and you're putting that as kind of the default value in that hidden form there?
No, so you can't do it as a default value. So that would be on the website, on the browser side, on the front end. And so oftentimes when an organization is using Google Analytics, they're also using Google Tag Manager. So you could inject it using a tag that basically says, listen, is there a Marketo form here? If yes, pull down the client ID with that code that I spoke of, and basically make that the value of that hidden field if it's a hidden field value. Otherwise, if you're also going to be adding that hidden field on the front end, just saying like, this is the field name and then this is the value, and that value being that script that I talked about.
Okay, thanks.
Well, great. It sounds like things are slowing down a little bit from a questions standpoint. So I think if everybody's okay with it, we can maybe wrap up a little bit early today. Lydia, I just want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wealth of knowledge about how to make all these connections. I know I've always been impressed by your technical acumen with these things. So thank you so much.